Okay, so welcome back. This is another attempt in trying to produce a history video. I've been having a little trouble today as the cat has been trying to get my attention. She's done this by playing around with the webcam and the cords and everything, and she's now off to the side just licking herself. So hopefully she won't be too much of a bother today. But anyway, this is the second of a series of videos on the church, the history of the church. I'm kind of doing these out of order because it's kind of hard to go. Well, let's just say some topics are more interesting that I'm more excited about than others. And one of the topics I'm greatly excited about is American church history because it really is an interesting story of how the church in America came into existence, or not came into existence, but it's how it's been treated ever since the founding, since Columbus in 1492. But we're going to kind of jump a little bit back first. One of the things we need to understand is the what's happening in England and Mother England at this time, because the after effects of the Reformation, namely King Henry VIII, is still being felt. King Henry VIII wanted to have a son, and unfortunately, Catherine was unable to give him a son. So he asked the Pope to grant an annulment so that he could marry, and he said no. So as a result, Henry broke away from the church and declared himself to be the head of the church in England, forced everybody to swear allegiance to that. His daughter Mary, the firstborn, remained Catholic throughout her whole life and would suffer too for this. But history is usually written by the victors, and Mary is considered to be a bad queen by probably a lot of people in England. But you have to understand the intentions, what she was trying to do. Mary actually was a good queen. She was trying to bring England back to the church, trying to undo the damage her father did. But because she put to death unrepentant, and it's kind of a complicated thing, she had heretics burnt at the stake. Elizabeth did too. But Mary is considered to be Bloody Mary, while Elizabeth is considered to be Good Queen Bess. You know, the way, again, you have to understand this from a 15th century, 16th century viewpoint. The way I would explain it is, heresy can be like a cancer. If you don't treat the cancer, it could spread and get worse. Now, today we would not burn heretics. We should not burn heretics. But, heresy can be like an illness. And if you don't take care of it, if you don't deal with it, it can spread and cause even more damage. So, with that type of viewpoint, we could look at what Mary was trying to do in bringing England back to the church and trying to get those that were trying to lead her astray, try to do away with them. So, but this is going to carry over into the colonials that come to America. So, the three main powers, as we know, that founded America or the settled in America were the Spanish, the French, and the English. And it's important to understand their view towards the church, their attitude towards the church, because that usually reflected on how the people were treated. So Spain is Catholic at this time, still is. King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, 1492. It was in 1492 that Columbus sailed the ocean blue. It was also in 1492 that the Reconquista of Spain was finished, accomplished, and succeeded. This would be the 700-year process of expelling the Muslims out of Spain. Because when Muhammad came onto the scene in 632, within 100 years, they've conquered North Africa. They crossed the Strait of Gibraltar, and within 100 years, from 632, they're finally defeated at the Battle of Tours by Charles the Hammer Martel. And it's going to be over the next 700 years that slowly they would be repelled out of Europe and out of Spain. So Spain is Catholic. France is still Catholic. I put still Catholic at this time because up until the time of the French Revolution, France was a Catholic nation. And England, as I just said, was anti-Catholic. So this is going to carry over to America and the different the missions that they would establish. So as we know, the English settled on the eastern coast, the Spanish would settle in the south, and the French would settle kind of in the Midwest up to the northern part of Canada. So let's look at this. So as I said, Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492. We don't. He discovered, I think it would have been Cuba or one of the Caribbean nations, but discovered the New World, and the church would come along too. In America, the first mission would be established in St. Augustine, Florida, in 1565, and it's the oldest Catholic mission in our country. But the Spanish Franciscan friars would establish many missions in the southern part of our country. And you can see this in the names that they gave to our cities and the missions, like San Francisco, Los Angeles, San Diego, San Antonio, Corpus Christi, Latin for Body of Christ. So it still has an impact over 200 years later. Now, California was also one of the priests that had a big influence in California is now Saint Junipero Serra, as he established many missions in California. I think it was like 32 missions, and most of these are still around today. But in the East, which is being established by the English, they still are carrying the memories of the attempted the Guy Fawkes gunpowder plot in 1605, when Guy Fawkes, who was a Catholic, tried to blow up Parliament. It's celebrated and remembered in England even to this day. So remember the 5th of November. That's about all the poem I know, but they usually will burn Guy Fawkes in effigy. They'll have bonfires and fireworks. And if you see V for Vendetta, the mask that he's wearing is known as the Guy Fawkes mask. I thought I had a picture here. I don't. That's okay. But the Catholics that came to America and the English colonies would be greatly persecuted. Maryland will be an exception, but Maryland's kind of a complicated history. But the English, like the Spanish and others, would bring their views of Catholicism to America and enforce it on the Catholics. We're going to get into a lot of details on that coming up. So, again, England would persecute the church, France tolerated the church, and Spain tolerated the church. Now, the Puritans, this is the funny thing. Everybody says, every Thanksgiving we celebrate the Pilgrims. And good for them. I mean, the Pilgrims did take a leap of faith coming to this country. But the Pilgrims were Calvinists. And Calvinism is a really hard thing to explain, but they believe that man is totally corrupt and there's nothing he could do to get rid of the corruption. They're anti-Catholic. And they're going to greatly persecute the church, especially in Massachusetts. The interesting thing is, in 1620 it was established, but they came to America for religious freedom, but they wouldn't give religious freedom to Catholics. So, Virginia would be established in 1607. Oh, there's the Guy Fawkes Mass I thought about. Okay, so this is kind of the face of anarchy. This is the face of Guy Fawkes, the Catholic who tried to blow up Parliament. Anyway, interesting thing about Virginia. The first charter in 1606 established the Anglican Church as the Church of Virginia. But what's more interesting is the second charter in 1609, 3 years later, would forbid Catholics from immigrating to Virginia. Now, why I said Maryland's going to be an interesting history is there's going to be a little disagreements between Virginia and Maryland. Virginia's eventually going to invade Maryland and, again, force their views on the Catholics there. But Maryland is the rare exception, the rare English colony that would be tolerated, that would tolerate Catholics, and it's kind of a hard thing to explain. I still don't totally understand it, but it was established by George Calvert. He was a friend of the king. Even though he was a Catholic, he was a friend of the king. Again, it's kind of complicated, but you want to read some interesting history, look up the Lord Baltimore's. But the idea was he was given a charter and established a colony that was going to be a safe haven for Catholics. And the first priest that would come to America is Father Andrew White, comes with the settlers in Maryland, and he would celebrate Mass for the first time in the English colonies, 1634. He actually focused his ministry on the Native Americans. It's an interesting story about him was that he was taken prisoner by Richard Engel. I have to look up more information on him since it's been a long time since I looked at this. But he was kidnapped and taken back to England as a prisoner to stand trial. And the idea was that he was accused of entering England illegally. Well, thankfully the English realized what they were trying to do and released him. He came back to America. Now, the interesting thing is, in 1649, Maryland would issue a Tolerance Act, which would call for the religious toleration of all Christians, regardless of the denominations. But the exception would be those that denied the divinity of Jesus would be sentenced to death. Now, again, this is over 300, almost, got a ways to go before the 400th, but I mean, it's hard to judge 21st century views on something that happened in the 17th century. But again, unlike the other colonies, Maryland would grant religious tolerance to all Christians, regardless whether they were Catholic or not. But Virginia would also pass an edict of tolerance that only lasted for a year because the Puritans would revolt a year later and establish Puritanism as the religion of Virginia. So again, everybody praises the Pilgrims and everything. I don't. So Maryland and Virginia are going to hate each other, and Virginia would invade Maryland in 1654, would conquer it, and repeal the Act of Toleration. So Maryland's going to go from a colony that's supposed to be a safe haven for Catholics to persecuting the Catholics. So in 1692, the Church of England, Anglican, would become the official church of Maryland, and that would last until 1702. See, the thing I would love to do is I would love to read the history of each of the states, how it came across, or how it came to be. And just, again, it's a lot more complicated than just saying in 1692 the Church of England was the official church of Maryland. But this isn't meant to be in-depth history. This is meant to be an overview of history. One of the books I will probably try to put in the description bar is called American Catholics. I'm trying to see. I believe it's by Hennessy. It's a book that goes up from the time of Columbus up until the early 80s when it was written. It's still a very good book, even though it's 40 years old. We used it in the seminary, and I've used it many times too, and I used a lot of it in class. So Maryland's going to go from being a colony that was established for Catholics to one that would persecute Catholics. And this would be an interesting law. I always loved having the kids read this. So in 1715, they passed a law that said if a Protestant should die leaving a widow and children, and the widow marries a Catholic or becomes a Catholic, it's the duty of the governor to remove such children out of the custody of those parents and place them where they might be securely educated in the Protestant religion. It happened. So Charles Carroll is going to state that Maryland's no longer a place fit for Catholic to reside, and Charles Carroll would be the only Catholic signer of the Declaration of Independence. He wrote that to his son. Georgia is going to be, their charter, which is established in 1732, is going to grant freedom of religion to everybody but papists, everybody but Catholics. And as the document stated, all such persons except papists should have a free exercise of the religion, so they be contented with the quiet and peaceable enjoyment of the same. American history is interesting. Pennsylvania would be established by William Penn. I spent many years in Pennsylvania between being in the seminary and having worked there before the seminary. My ancestors come from Pennsylvania. The Millers were from the Harrisburg area. I've been able to go back a few times since. I actually got to see the grave of my fifth great grandfather and the graves of my fourth great grandparents. And again, just, family history is really neat. And it's just mind blowing to consider how we're even here, because my fifth great grandfather had 14 kids, and my fourth great grandmother from him had 14 of her own. There's like 11,000 descendants because of those two today. So in 1733, Old St. Joseph's in Philadelphia would be built. I've been able to attend that parish. Second would be Old St. Mary's, 1763. We had Mass there once when I was in the seminary. But Philadelphia at the time, 70% of the Catholic population's German. But eventually the city would grow, and as the city grew, the need for more churches would grow. And here comes Bosco. Come on. Come on. So Old St. Mary's would be established. American history. The number of priests between 1634 and 1776, there's only 100 priests for the 13 colonies. And the reason for that is just to show the limited number of priests. So because there's not as many priests, life is going to revolve around the home. The faith's going to be lived at the home. Because I have to move this out of the way from the cat. There's not enough families for a parish to be established. The priest might come maybe once a month or so. St. John Neumann, the fourth bishop of Philadelphia, used to travel horseback between parishes. So the family life is going to be taught at the home. There's no Catholic schools. Again, you might get Mass once in a blue moon. So baptisms would be done by the father. Marriages would be performed by a layman and then later blessed by the visiting priest. And I had this discussion recently with somebody. The minister of marriage is really the man and the wife, because it's the bride and the groom that administer the sacrament to each other. The priest is there on behalf of the church to witness the marriage and to bless it. So, but Catholic identity would be developed through the home, and we would see the devotions being lived at home, whether it's doing the Stations of the Cross, the family rosary, observing meatless Fridays. So even as we're in this pandemic situation right now, where all the liturgies have been suspended, this is going to be one of the weirdest Holy Weeks of my life. I've never experienced this. Being on my own, I don't think I'm going to celebrate the Easter Vigil, mostly because it's a very intense Mass. It's the high Mass of the year, but there's so much that happens within it, it's hard to do it on my own. So, but anyway, going back to it, one of the things we might have heard of before is the idea of the hiding place for priests. If you've seen the movie Skyfall, James Bond's Skyfall, it came out about 7-8 years ago. Honestly, I think it's the last best Bond movie. But there's a hiding place where they sneak behind the fireplace. And the idea for the hiding priest was that if the authorities were coming, they hear that a priest is near or in the house or visiting somebody, the priest had a chance to hide, not to be seen. So that way he wouldn't be caught. Okay, so let's look at Spanish. 1492 to 1504, Columbus makes 4 voyages to the New World. Cortez conquers Mexico. And interesting thing we'll talk about is in 1531, the apparition of Our Lady to Saint Juan Diego. So we don't really need to see this, but Columbus's first voyage. The reason that I mentioned Our Lady of Guadalupe is this is going to be a turning point in Mexican history. In December 1531, Our Lady appeared to Saint Juan Diego, and this is at a time when human sacrifices are still happening. But over the next 10 years, about 10 million people would be converted to the faith, baptized. And if one was to go to Mexico City, they could still see the tilma of Juan Diego. I am going to try to see how I can link this up. I remember watching Unsolved Mysteries as a kid with Robert Stack. They actually did a segment on the tilma of Our Lady of Guadalupe. Long story short, the Bishop of Mexico City wanted a sign because Juan Diego is a poor peasant, says that Our Lady wants a basilica built. Well, what are you going to do if somebody says that Mary appeared to you and telling you to build this big church? Let's be honest, we're going to dismiss him as being crazy. So the bishop asked Juan Diego, it's like, okay, if Mary's appearing to you, have her give me a sign. Well, Juan relayed this message to Our Lady, and Our Lady told him to go up to the top of a hill. And again, this is in December when it's cold. At the top of the hill were a bunch of roses. Again, December, it should not be there. So Our Lady arranged them in his tilma and had him take the roses to the bishop. And when he unveiled the tilma, released the roses to show the roses, this image of Our Lady appeared on the tilma. And again, this is 1531. We're going to be celebrating the 500th anniversary of this in what? 11 years? The type of cloth that is used for this should have disintegrated many, 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 many years ago. But it still hasn't. And even in the 1920s, when there was a great persecution against the church by the... can't remember who exactly, but somebody tried to blow up the image. And this cross here is right by the image of Our Lady of Guadalupe. As you can see, it was greatly damaged, but the image of Our Lady was not. So between 1610 and 1767, 32 missions, so I was right on that, is established within the Spanish territory. And I was wrong on this part. St. Junipero Serra would be responsible for 21 of those missions. Okay, so the French. The French are going to settle along the Mississippi River and the Great Lakes. So I grew up in Iowa. The impact of the French are still there. The archdiocese in Iowa is Dubuque. My grandmother comes from Dubuque. So it's going to be the French Jesuits who accompanies them, and they're going to try to convert the Indians, the Native Americans. One of these, and there would be many martyrs. At Auriesville, New York, is where the North American Martyrs Shrine. It's in the same area as the birthplace of St. Kateri Tekakwitha, one of the converts, a young Indian girl that would die of smallpox, I believe. I've had a chance once to visit the North American Martyrs Shrine. On my trip back to the seminary, I took a little side trip because I wanted to go see Cooperstown. And it turned out that the North American Martyrs Shrine is about 20 minutes north of Cooperstown. So I went there, and then I went to Cooperstown. But anyway, St. Rene Guopel, I probably mispronounced that, but he's the first canonized martyr of America, and that was in 1642. Then St. John, not even going to try that, Lalandi, but St. Isaac Jogues, that one I know. St. Isaac Jogues shows the devotion that the missionaries had when they came to America, because he was captured by the Mohawks and they bit the thumbs off of him. Part of the reason for this was, these are the canonical digits. You hold the host with these fingers. Well, if you don't have thumbs, you really can't hold the host and you can't celebrate Mass. So Isaac Jogues would eventually escape. And he would return to the Indians again. He was given a dispensation. In other words, the fact that he didn't have thumbs, they waved that away, that restriction. He could still celebrate Mass, and he ended up being martyred in 1646. So, Blessed Kateri, now St. Kateri Tekakwitha, this slide's a few years old. Again, I've been out of education for a number of years, so. But she was the daughter of an Indian chief and a Christian mother. She died at the age of 24. Peter Claver would be a minister to slaves in Colombia and Latin America. It was said that he baptized over 300,000 slaves during his work down there, and his feast day is on the 9th of September. We'll come back to this another time. One of the complaints against the church is that the church didn't speak out enough about slavery. That's not exactly true. Just to look at Pope Gregory the 16th here, from 1839, and Supremo Apostolicis, document that the Pope issued, which condemns the slave trade and forbids trading in slaves and defending slavery. This would be met at the Fourth Council of Baltimore. We'll talk about that in another video, but this is where from the Baltimore Councils, is where we would get the Baltimore Catechism, which my grandparents, my dad, my mom, people 50 plus years ago would have learned the faith from it. So the church has been strong in their condemnation of slavery. Okay, so America declares independence from England July 4th, 1776. Having gone to school in Philadelphia, I took advantage of visiting all the sites. I've been to Independence Hall many times. I've seen the Liberty Bell many times, to the point where I don't ever have to see it again, and I'll be fine if I never see it again. It is truly a sight to see. It really is. But I've been there probably 10 times already. So, the only Catholic that would sign the Declaration would be Charles Carroll from Maryland, as we said. Some other Catholics that are important in the American history would be John Barry, Commodore John Barry. There's debate over John Paul Smith. But John Barry would be known as the father of the American Navy. Francis Scott Key, the author of the Star-Spangled Banner, the national anthem. He was Catholic. He wrote that during the War of 1812. But again, the anti-Catholic attitudes are still present in the English colonies, to the point where the bishop for America would be in Rome, because America is still considered to be missionary territory. And since the colonies are still part of English territory, the English colonies bishop would be the bishop of the English, which would be in Rome. But after we win our independence, Catholics are going to be afraid of having a foreigner as a bishop, because we just won independence from a foreign power, and now Catholics are going to be governed by a foreign bishop. So, yeah, that's part of the reason that they're going to ask to have an American bishop. So, again, kind of highlighting this, before 1776, the American Church answered to the Bishop of Rome, who was in charge of England. Now that we won independence, now that we are free of England and the influence of England, American Catholics are afraid of what the appearance would be if they were to have a foreigner as a bishop in America. Again, overthrew one foreign ruler, now you're going to have another one. So, we're going to skip that. One of the things that England tried to do during the Revolutionary War, they passed the Quebec Act, which was an English Parliament resolution that granted freedom of religion to Catholics in Quebec. And the part of this was, hopefully, by doing this, that Canadians would not get involved in the American Revolution. We have our freedom. So, I believe Benjamin Franklin was part of the delegation that went along with Bishop Carroll to try to persuade the Canadians to help America. Anyway, so John Carroll would be the first bishop in America, 1789, Bishop of Baltimore. Became the first archbishop in 1808 when the 4 new dioceses were added. About 12 years ago, Pope Benedict XVI came to America to help celebrate the bicentennial of these four new dioceses, which would be Bardstown, which is Louisville today, New York, Boston, and Philadelphia. Well, being in Philadelphia at the time of the bicentennial, we got to go to the papal events. So I got to see Pope Benedict, and that was a thrill. First college, he would establish the first college, which is Georgetown in D.C., 1791. And he also built the first cathedral in Baltimore, National Shrine of the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary. One of the trips we took to the March for Life, we took a trip to Baltimore, and I had a chance to say Mass at the Basilica. I also got to pray at the tomb of Bishop Carroll, so that was a good thrill. That was a good time. But this was one of the few times, very, very rare, that Americans would be allowed to choose their own bishop. And the priests came together and they voted 24-1 to elect John Carroll as the first American bishop. I wonder who the one vote against him was. Anyway, as a result of this, Baltimore becomes the first diocese in America, which is why it's known as the Primal See. So even today, Baltimore still has a place of importance in the American church. It's one of the reasons that the bishops usually meet in Baltimore every year for their annual meeting. So in 1791, he calls for the first meeting of American priests and talks about the need for a seminary to be established in America to train its future priests. This would become St. Mary's, which is in Baltimore. It still is today. I've not been there. But how it's going to be run is the tuition from Georgetown would help finance the seminary. And Carroll's a big influence in the early church in America. He's a friend of Washington. I would love to read more about that. He interceded with Washington to develop missions to the Indians. And when Washington died, Carroll declared a day of mourning. And we'll get to that too. So in 1803, the Louisiana Purchase doubles the size of the Diocese of Baltimore. So again, the colonies would be the part of the first diocese, because really it's only the Diocese of Baltimore. It's not the Archdiocese yet. So with Louisiana being purchased, the size of America is doubled. And in 1808, as I just said, the church had grown so much that 4 new dioceses are established. So again, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Bardstown. So just to show you where they are on the map. We were taught that when the Washington Monument was being built, that Bishop Carroll was supposed to have the honor of laying the cornerstone, but he was too ill to attend. He ended up dying that fall. Interesting thing about the Washington Monument is, if you ever been in it, you'll notice when you come down from the top, they'll have the elevator become like transparent so you can see the stones. Each of the states sent a stone, countries sent a stone to be built in it. The Vatican even sent a stone to be put in the Washington Monument. The problem was the know-nothings, the anti-Catholics, took the stone and threw it in the Potomac. Okay, so let's look at what Carroll's dealing with at this time. At the time of America, there were 70,000 Catholics, 70 priests, and 80 churches. And one of the early issues that they're going to have to deal with is trusteeism. So it'd be like the parish council, but the parish council would have the ability to hire and fire the priest. So if they don't like the priest's sermon, father's always talking about abortion, or father's always talking about why gay marriage is wrong, and if they get offended, then they would fire him. That's not the way it's supposed to work. So Carroll is going to oppose this, and like I said, it's been many years since I've looked at this. So trusteeism would be a reason why no bishop was appointed in Philadelphia in 1814. I'm going to look that up again. It's been a while since I've looked at this. Uh, Along the time of Bishop Carroll is the time of Elizabeth Ann Seton, who is the first American saint, first native-born American saint in 1975. She was married to an Episcopalian shipper, very wealthy, came from a wealthy family, and her husband died shortly after they took a trip to Italy. Died in Italy, and the family that she stayed with had a chapel that Elizabeth spent time in prayer, and it was in that she came to understand Jesus and the church, and would be received into the church. So Bishop Carroll is going to pick her to start a religious order and a school, which still exists today. Okay, moving west, America takes Texas in 1836. War of 1812. Again, whole books are written on this, and I'm just going to do this in a slide. Anyway, I think we'll come back to that. It's a little too early for that. Okay, so one of the big terms that I've been saying already is nativism. This would be the anti-Catholic, anti-immigrant movement, and the term you may have heard is the Know-Nothings. Example from movies that I would say is The Gangs of New York. Shows the nativists, and again, I believe they used the Know-Nothings in that movie. It's been a while since I've seen it, but immigration in America is going to explode during the 1840s, 1850s. So in 1820, you have about 8,300 immigrants coming to America. 30 years later, you have almost 500,000. So, and the majority of these are going to be Irish. Myself, I'm about 60-some% Irish, and my ancestors came over to America during this time. So we know Ireland is Catholic. Well, 47% of the immigrants in 1840 are Catholic from Ireland. Germans are going to make up 35% of the immigrants. Well, Bavaria, the south part of Germany, is still very Catholic. So, yeah, so Germany is going to be a mixture of Catholic and Protestants. The English would make up 10% of the immigrants. Well, they're not Catholic. So, the majority of immigrants coming to America are Catholic, and this is going to be seen as a threat by the nativists. A term you may have heard is called WASP, White Anglo-Saxon Protestant. So, just to show you a map of the different immigrants coming to America between 1840 and 1860. Again, look at the bottom. You have Irish, the Germans, English, and France. So, I believe it was I have a little bit of French in my background. That would have been about 1880. I have to look that up, that they came to America. But again, going into Philadelphia history here, in 1844 there would be riots. The word was getting around that Catholics were trying to get the Bible removed from the school. It was a time when Bible was part of schooling. So people rioted. They attacked Catholic churches. They burnt 2 of them to the ground and actually took a cannon to a third. I've actually been to one of these churches, the one that was spared. But again, I took advantage of being in Philadelphia for 4 years, seeing as much history as I can. But it got to be so bad that Archbishop Kenrick, I think it is, ended up canceling masses that weekend. My favorite story from this time is by the Archbishop of New York City, Bishop John Hughes, known as Dagger John. The rioters were going to go from Philadelphia up to New York City, and the mayor of New York is a nativist. In other words, he's an anti-Catholic. Well, I'm not going to stop them if they want to burn churches. The only difference is the bishop told the mayor that if one church is touched, he would turn New York City into another Moscow. This was a reference to what Napoleon did to Moscow. In other words, in 1812, he burnt Moscow to the ground. and the majority of the firefighters are Irish Catholic. So, do you really think the Irish Catholics are going to stand by if the natives are attacking their churches? Burn the city to the ground. Anyway, nothing happened, thankfully. But wrapping this up, looking at some of the anti-Irish, anti-Catholic images from this time, I don't remember where I found this image, but as the story below says, as we've dared to call the monkeys in the zoo by Irish names, Aaron's son and Raph declares us snobs and flunkies and demand that we withdraw them, nor should we ignore their claims, for it really is very hard upon the monkeys. So the Irish are going to be displayed as stupid, drunk monkeys, lower than human, as you can see in the Irish Frankenstein. And then the Irish compared to the Anglo and the Negro. So the ideal American would be an Anglo. This famous image is from the Civil War time. Notice how the scales are labeled with North and South, black and white. So the saying basically is that the Southern black is the equivalent of the Irish Northerner. And just to look at the faces, the way the faces are displayed. Common saying, let Negroes be servants, and if not Negroes, let Irishmen fill their place. Another famous sign, help wanted, no Irish need apply. But the Irish are again portrayed as drunks, belligerent. St. Patrick's Day, the way we celebrate, rum and blood. Again, look at the faces of the Irish. I don't know if my cursor will come here, but notice the way this one looks. And then look at the way the policemen look. So, again, Irish are a bunch of hooligans, according to them. The funny thing is, I find that every St. Patrick's Day, everybody wants to be Irish. That wasn't so back in the 1860s. I have to laugh at the thought that many of these nativist descendants are now trying to say that they're Irish and celebrate St. Patrick's Day when their ancestors would have been horrified by this thought. So, this image of two forces, Ireland versus Britain. Britain's protecting a helpless woman, while Ireland is angry and can't really see on the hat that well because of the pixelated image, but it says anarchy. Uncle Sam's lodging house. You notice how it's made up of the French, the Japanese, the Spanish, the Negro, Russian, German, Englishman. The only one that's complaining is the Irish. They even got the Irish flag with the harp there. So, usual way of doing things. Again, Irish portrayed as being drunks and belligerent, playing with fire. Could be relevant to what we face today. Immigrants coming to this country and sending their money back to the homeland. So the Irish come to America, work, earn money, and then send it home. That's from 1882. Representative James Blaine, 1830 to 1893, proposed an amendment to ban the funding of religious-run schools. We're still facing that today. It was okay for the Congress to fund public schools that taught Protestant beliefs, but heaven forbid we should fund a Catholic school. Well, today no faith can be in the school. This is a famous image from, I think it was Thomas Nast, modern day author of The Image of Santa Claus, as the fat, jolly old man, red suit and everything. That was Thomas Nast. Thomas Nast was also a very anti-Catholic bigot. This was his drawing of the American River Ganges. It shows Rome off to the distance while the Protestant fathers are trying to defend their children from the oncoming swarm of crocodiles. But if you tilt your head and look at it sideways, you'll notice that it's actually bishop mitres. That it's actually bishops in the vestments coming out of the sea. So, see, this is going to come back in the election of 1928 when Al Smith, the governor of New York, would become the first Catholic to be nominated for the presidency. The fear was that the Pope was going to try to take over America. That came up again in 60 when John F. Kennedy ran for president. Didn't come up in 2008 when John Kerry, or 2000 when John Kerry ran. KKK is not only anti-black but also very anti-Catholic. Again, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. KKK will defend America from the Catholics. Big mistrust of the convents at this time. I'm going to try to do a video on that. Again, I don't remember where I found that, but Pope Leo XIII. This one is a guy trying to choose between home rule with no allegiance to any foreign ruler, which would be the state, liberty, and then versus the papal tiara, the three-crown tiara, foreign rule, first allegiance to the infallible Pope of Rome, again, misunderstanding what infallibility is, and the title church and state. This was a book I found once called Christ or the Pope, America or Rome. This was an image in the book of the minister's happy family, looking so serene, so serious, so holy, versus the priest home. Anyway. And then they would have this image showing the reason why we don't give the precious blood to the laity, because even though we believe it is the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus Christ truly present within the appearances of bread and wine. Even though the substance of wine is now changed into the blood of Christ, it still retains the accidental qualities of wine. In other words, alcohol remains. So even though alcohol is not wine, it's a property of wine. The properties remain, but the substance is changed. So if you drink too much of precious blood, you'll feel it. Again, big battle between who's going to educate the child. Will it be the church or will it be the state? Love this one. Wake up, Uncle Sam. The Jesuit has his hand on the press of your country. We'll probably come back to that another time. The idea, one of the anti-Catholic rumors was that Lincoln was born a Catholic, baptized a Catholic, and ended up leaving the church, which made him a renegade and an apostolate. And basically, Rome killed Lincoln, is what they're trying to say. Finish with this one. This one was at the time when I was in Philadelphia. This was in the Philadelphia Inquirer. This was the day after that the Supreme Court upheld a ban on partial birth abortion, which basically says that you can't deliver a baby partway, then stab it in the neck, suck out the brains, basically killing the kid, and then deliver the rest of it. It was decided by a 5-4 ruling. The 5 that happened to vote against or to uphold the ban were Catholic. So the next day, the Catholics that voted to uphold the ban were depicted as wearing bishop mitres with the title church and state. So they look all happy while the dissenting opponents look sad and downcast. Anyway, so this was just a basic overview. Again, keyword basic overview of the beginning of American church history. There's so much more that could be said. Probably a video could be broken up into each of these topics. But I'm going to do a lot of this over the next few days. This is April 1st today. As you know, we are on lockdown for another month. I'm not going anywhere, so I'm going to try to really work on building up the content on my channel. Be sure to hit the like button. Make sure you hit the bell to subscribe, so that way anytime a video is released, you'll be notified. And please share this video. If you have any comments, just leave them on the comment page and I'll try to answer them. So until next time, God bless.